She was promised in an arranged marriage to an unknown man in a coma. On the day he woke up, she discovered that he was the most dangerous mafioso in the city. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. Madison held the strap of her purse tightly as she walked through the corridors of the most luxurious private hospital in the city. Her steps echoed on the polished marble, each sound amplifying the anxiety growing in her chest. She had imagined this moment hundreds of times, but never managed to form a clear image of the man her family had chosen to be her husband. A businessman in a coma for 3 months, they said. Someone who needed care, who would be grateful for her presence when he awoke. But something in her mother's evasive tone always left her uneasy. Why do I feel they're hiding something from me? The hospital suite revealed itself to be more like a 5-star hotel room than a medical environment. Expensive flowers decorated the tables, a large screen television dominated one wall, and the hospital bed seemed specially designed to offer maximum comfort. Madison took a deep breath before pushing the door, preparing herself to meet a fragile man, perhaps connected to machines, someone who would depend on her compassion. What she didn't expect was to feel the air completely escape from her lungs the moment her eyes met his. He was awake, completely alert, and watching her with an intensity that made her question if she could still breathe normally. My God, what have they done to me? Alexander wasn't what she had imagined in her worst nightmares or best dreams. His dark eyes seemed to search every corner of her soul, reading secrets she didn't even know she kept. Subtle marks on his face and hands told stories of a past that Madison suspected was complex. Even lying in the hospital bed, wearing only the hospital gown, he emanated an authority that made her involuntarily step back. You must be Madison. His voice was deep, controlled, without any trace of the fragility she expected to find. Madison nodded, unable to form words while trying to process the reality before her eyes. He didn't seem sick, much less fragile. Every movement, however small, carried a calculated precision that left her alert. When he sat up in bed, Madison noticed how the muscles in his arms contracted under tanned skin, and how his shoulders filled the gown in a way that defied any notion of vulnerability. The way he studied her made her feel as if she was being evaluated, weighed, judged by criteria completely unknown to her. I didn't know you had already awakened. I woke up 2 hours ago, he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. Time enough to put some things in perspective. Alexander tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. You're younger than I imagined. There was something in his tone that made her feel as if she was being examined under a microscope. Madison crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive gesture that didn't go unnoticed by him. The way his lips curved into a half-smile suggested he was accustomed to causing this kind of reaction in people. How old are you, Madison? 22, she answered, forcing her voice to sound firmer than she felt. And you? The question came out before she could think better of it, and she immediately regretted it when she saw how his eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't the type of question one asked someone who was clearly used to being the one who controlled conversations. Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and Madison noticed how the movement caused the gown to open slightly at the chest, revealing more scars that spread across his skin like a map of past battles. She quickly looked away, feeling heat rise up her neck. 35, old enough to know that arranged marriages rarely end like fairy tales. Before Madison could respond, the door opened and 3 men entered the suite. They wore expensive suits and moved with a synchronization that suggested military training or something equally rigorous. What disturbed her most was how they bowed slightly toward Alexander, a gesture of respect that went far beyond what would be offered to a simple businessman. The tallest man approached the bed and whispered something in Alexander's ear, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Madison felt a chill in her stomach as she observed the exchange, realizing there were layers to this situation she didn't understand. The doctors are on their way for the final examination, said the man, his voice carrying an accent Madison couldn't identify. Tell them to wait, Alexander replied, without taking his eyes off Madison. I'm not finished here. The authority in his voice was absolute, the kind of command that admitted no questions. The 3 men immediately withdrew, closing the door behind them with an almost reverential silence. Madison felt as if the air in the room had become thicker, charged with a tension she couldn't name. The way he had dismissed those men, clearly subordinates, with a simple phrase, made her question exactly who her family had committed her to. Who were those men? Employees, Alexander answered, his response as vague as it was deliberate. He rose from the bed with a gracefulness that completely contradicted his supposed condition as a recovering patient. Madison instinctively stepped back when he stood up, revealing a height that made her tilt her head to meet his eyes. Even in the hospital robe, it was impossible to ignore the dominant physical presence he emanated. His hands, which she had noticed before, were now close enough for her to see the scars in detail. Small marks that spoke of a turbulent past, some older, others more recent. You seem frightened, Madison. That offends me. I'm not frightened, she lied, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance that only served to intensify the interest in his eyes. Just surprised. I expected to find someone different. Madison forced herself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct in her body advised her to look away. There was something predatory in the way he observed her, as if he were cataloguing every micro-expression, every involuntary reaction. When he took a step toward her, she noticed his scent, something expensive and masculine that contrasted strangely with the hospital environment. My family told me you were a businessman. And I am, Alexander replied, stopping just an arm's length away from her. Among other things. The smile that curved his lips didn't reach his eyes, and Madison felt a shiver run down her spine. There were layers to his words that she suspected were dangerous to explore. He tilted his head slightly, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being dissected. Your family was very economical with the details about me, I imagine. They tend to do that when they believe the complete truth might be inconvenient. Madison swallowed hard, realizing that there was much more happening here than a simple matrimonial agreement. What kind of businessman needs bodyguards? The question hung in the air between them like a sharp blade. Alexander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly circled around her, forcing her to turn to follow his movements. It was a clearly calculated gesture to demonstrate control, to show that he dictated the pace of their conversation. Madison felt every muscle in her body tense as he completed the circle, stopping exactly where he had begun, but now close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper that forced her to lean slightly to hear. The kind that has enemies, Madison. Many enemies. The brutal honesty of his response left her momentarily speechless. Madison had grown up in a world where problems were solved with polite conversations and civilized compromises. The idea of living in a universe where one needed protection against enemies was as alien as it was terrifying. She studied his face, looking for signs that he was exaggerating, but found only an absolute seriousness that made her swallow hard. The scars she had noticed earlier now made a sinister sense, each mark telling a story of violence that she preferred not to imagine. And you expect me to marry someone who lives under constant threat? I expect you to honor the agreement your family made, Alexander replied, his voice gaining an edge of coldness that made her step back. Just as I will honor my part of the deal. He tilted his head, observing her reaction with clinical interest. But if you're having second thoughts, Madison, now would be the time to express them. Once we leave this hospital as an engaged couple, there will be no turning back. The finality in his voice was absolute, and Madison realized that he wasn't making a threat, but simply stating a fact. The difference between the two concepts frightened her more than any direct threat could have done. Are you giving me a choice? I'm offering clarity, he corrected, moving closer again until she could count every dark eyelash that framed his eyes. Your family has already made the choice, as has mine. But you can still decide whether you want to do this out of obligation or if you prefer to find a way to make the situation mutually beneficial. The way he said those last words made something stir in Madison's stomach, a mixture of fear and something else she didn't want to name. Her eyes briefly dropped to his lips before quickly returning to his eyes, but he noticed the movement, and his smile deepened. You're more interesting than I expected, Madison. Before she could respond, firm knocks on the door interrupted the moment. Come in, Alexander said, his voice returning to the authoritative tone she was beginning to recognize. Two doctors entered, carrying clipboards and emanating the professional efficiency of those accustomed to dealing with important patients. They greeted Alexander with a deference that confirmed Madison's growing suspicions about her future husband's true identity. As the doctors prepared for the examination, Alexander began to turn away but stopped, his eyes meeting hers one last time. The intensity of his gaze made her feel as if he were etching her image into his memory, cataloging every detail for future reference. "I'll be at home when you've made your decision." He turned his back to dismiss the doctors with murmured instructions, but she still felt the weight of those dark eyes upon her, as if he could see her even without looking directly. Madison remained standing in the same spot, observing how he effortlessly commanded the room, how the professionals around him moved to accommodate his needs without question. The reality of who he really was began to form in her mind like a sinister puzzle. The scars, the bodyguards, the absolute authority, the way everyone around him showed a respect that bordered on fear. When the door closed behind the doctors who left to fetch equipment, she realized she was alone with a man who had completely redefined her understanding of power and danger. What world have I gotten myself into? The black car slid silently through the wrought iron gates that opened automatically, revealing a property that took Madison's breath away. The mansion rose before her like something out of a movie, with its classic Mediterranean lines and gardens that seemed to have been carefully planned for generations. Tall palm trees lined the circular entrance, while marble fountains created a gentle symphony of running water that contrasted with the tense silence inside the vehicle. The driver, a middle-aged man who hadn't said a word during the entire journey, stopped in front of the main white marble staircase. Madison observed through the window, trying to process that this would be her home for the next few months, while the wedding preparations were finalized. How does someone get a house like this with just legal business? An elegant woman of approximately 50 years came down the stairs to receive her, her graceful movements suggesting years of etiquette training. She wore a discreet but clearly expensive dress, and her grey hair was tied in an impeccable bun that accentuated her aristocratic features. When she opened the car door for Madison, her smile was warm, but there was something in her eyes that suggested caution, as if she were evaluating the new resident of the house. "Miss Madison, welcome. I have been the housekeeper of this home for 20 years, and I will be here for anything you need." Madison nodded, noting how the woman had avoided mentioning Alexander's name, referring only to the house as if it were an entity of its own. "Is he home?" "The master is in a meeting," the housekeeper responded, while guiding Madison up the marble stairs. "But he left instructions for you to feel at home and explore the property at will." Her words were carefully chosen, carrying a subtext that Madison began to decipher. Alexander was present, but inaccessible. The entrance hall was impressive, with high ceilings decorated with delicate frescoes and a crystal chandelier that projected patterns of light on the marble walls. Madison immediately noticed the men discreetly positioned at strategic points, dressed as house staff, but with postures that betrayed their true purpose. Their eyes followed her as she walked, not in a threatening way, but with the constant vigilance of trained professionals. "How many people work here?" "Enough to keep everything running perfectly," was the housekeeper's evasive response as they climbed the main staircase. The walls were decorated with paintings that Madison suspected were originals by famous masters, each illuminated by discreet lights that enhanced their vibrant colors. The second-floor corridor extended in both directions, dotted with dark wooden doors that remained closed, like guardians of secrets. The housekeeper stopped before a double door at the end of the right corridor, producing a golden key from her pocket. "This will be your suite while you are with us. The master insisted that you have complete privacy and comfort." Madison accepted the key, realizing it was the only copy, a gesture that could be interpreted as respect for her privacy or as a subtle form of confinement. "And where is his room?" The question made the housekeeper hesitate for an almost imperceptible moment before pointing to the end of the opposite corridor. "The master's suite is in the east wing of the house. The master values his privacy greatly, especially during the business meetings that frequently take place." The way she emphasized the word business made it clear that Madison should avoid that area of the house during certain hours. It was an unspoken rule, but absolutely clear. Madison nodded, understanding that she was being gently informed about the limits of her freedom in this house. The housekeeper opened the suite door, revealing a room that was more luxurious than any five-star hotel Madison had ever seen. Meals are served in the main hall at 8 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and 8 in the evening. The master always dines at 8 o'clock sharp. Madison explored her new suite with a mixture of admiration and unease. The king-size bed was decorated with Italian silk sheets and pillows that seemed to have been chosen by a professional designer. A private balcony offered a view of the back gardens, where she could see an infinity pool that merged with the horizon. The closet was already partially filled with clothes in her exact size, expensive and elegant pieces that would never be within reach of her normal budget. The precision of the sizes disturbed her. Someone had investigated very intimate details about her, even before their first meeting. Madison sat in the balcony chair, observing the gardens. When she noticed men in gardener uniforms working among the plants, their movements too efficient for ordinary gardeners. Even the gardeners are disguised guards. The first day passed in cautious exploration. Madison discovered a library with volumes in various languages, many about history, military strategy, and international economics. A music room housed a grand piano that seemed not to have been played recently, its keys impeccably clean, but cold to the touch. The office had its doors locked, as did a room on the ground floor that she suspected was where the mysterious business meetings took place. During her walks, Madison began to mentally map the routine of the house. Men came and went at regular hours, black cars parked discreetly at the back of the property, and phones rang constantly somewhere distant in the house. With each discovery, her curiosity about Alexander grew proportionally to her fear of what she might discover. What exactly does he command from this house? When dinner time arrived, Madison carefully dressed in one of the dresses she had found in her closet, an elegant navy blue piece that fit her body perfectly. She descended the stairs at 8 o'clock sharp, following the housekeeper's instructions, and found the formal dining room prepared for 2 people. The mahogany table could easily accommodate 12 people, but only 2 chairs had been positioned at opposite ends, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional distance between them. Candles illuminated the environment, with a soft light that should have been romantic, but only accentuated the tension in the air. Alexander was already seated, wearing a dark suit without a tie, the first button of his shirt open revealing a line of tanned skin. "I hope you have found everything to your liking." "The house is beautiful," Madison replied, choosing her words carefully as she sat in the chair that a silent staff member had pulled out for her. The distance between them at the table required them to slightly raise their voices to converse, an arrangement that was clearly purposeful. Alexander observed her as she settled in, his eyes traveling over the dress she wore with silent approval that made her blush slightly. Dinner was served by staff who moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing with dishes without making the slightest noise. The food was exquisite, each dish a culinary work of art, but Madison could barely taste anything under the constant weight of Alexander's penetrating gaze. "You seem tense. Any problems with the accommodations?" "It's not the house," Madison replied, setting down her fork as she gathered courage to confront him. "It's the people. Your staff seem more like soldiers than household employees." She observed his reaction carefully, looking for any sign that her suspicions were correct. Alexander cut his meat with precise movements, each gesture controlled and deliberate, before meeting her eyes with that intensity that made her feel as if she were being analyzed. And gardeners who carry communication equipment on their belts aren't exactly common. The way he paused before bringing the fork to his mouth confirmed that she had hit the mark. "You're very observant for your own good, Madison." "Or perhaps you're not as discreet as you think," she replied, surprising herself with her own audacity. The tension in the room changed instantly, as if the air had become electrically charged. Alexander set down his utensils slowly, his movements deliberately controlled in a way that made her realize he was deciding how to respond. When he leaned slightly forward, Madison felt like prey being studied by a predator that hadn't yet decided if it was hungry. The staff serving dinner seemed to have magically disappeared, leaving them alone in the vastness of the dining hall. Would you prefer that I lie to you or be honest about who I am? The question caught her off guard, its brutal honesty contrasting with the polite evasions she had expected. Madison studied his face, looking for signs that he was testing or manipulating her, but found only an absolute seriousness that both frightened and intrigued her simultaneously. "I prefer the truth," she answered, her voice firmer than expected. "Even if it's frightening." Alexander nodded slowly, as if she had passed some kind of test he had prepared. He rose from his chair and walked to the large window that offered a view of the illuminated gardens. His hands crossed behind his back in a posture that suggested he was carefully weighing his next words. "Then you deserve to know that your safety here depends on you accepting certain realities without questioning them." Madison felt her heart race, not just because of what he had said, but because of how he had said it. It wasn't a threat but a warning, and the difference was terrifying. She rose from the table, her movements cautious as she approached the window where he stood. The physical proximity between them created a different tension, more intimate, that made her realize how physically imposing he was even when relaxed. His masculine scent mingled with the aroma of garden flowers coming through the open window, creating a combination she knew she would remember forever. "And if I can't accept those realities?" The question came out as a whisper, laden with all the doubts and fears she had accumulated since arriving at this house. "Then we'll make this work in other ways," Alexander replied, turning to face her. The proximity between them was now minimal, and Madison could see the details of his eyes that the candlelight made almost golden. There was something in his expression that suggested he was struggling with something internal, as if he were torn between protecting her from the truth and preparing her for it. His hands remained at his sides, but Madison could feel the tension in them, as if he were forcing himself not to touch her. The way his eyes briefly dropped to her lips before returning to her eyes created a moment of sexual tension that made the air between them seem charged with electricity. "Are you afraid of me, Madison?" The question forced her to confront feelings she had tried to ignore since meeting him at the hospital. Fear was part of what she felt, but there were other more complicated emotions mixing in: fascination, attraction, curiosity. Madison looked into his eyes, searching for the person behind the mask of absolute control he wore, and for a moment believed she saw something vulnerable moving in the depths of his gaze. "I'm afraid of what you represent," she admitted, her honesty surprising them both, "but not of you." The distinction seemed to affect Alexander in a way she hadn't expected, his shoulders relaxing slightly, as if a tension he had carried for a long time had diminished. That distinction may be the only thing that saves us. Madison felt as if there were layers to this statement that she didn't fully understand, but something in the way he said it made her realize she was being included in something bigger than a simple arranged marriage. The way he looked at her changed subtly, as if he was seeing her for the first time not as an obligation, but as a person. The sexual tension between them was becoming almost palpable, and Madison realized she was entering dangerous territory, not just physically, but emotionally. "I should go up," she said, her voice betraying the reluctance she felt about leaving that moment unfinished. "It's been a long day." Alexander nodded, but didn't move to let her pass. "Madison," he said when she turned to leave the room, his voice carrying a quality she hadn't heard before. She stopped, waiting for him to continue, but he remained silent for so long that she began to turn again. "Good night," was all he said, but the way he said it made it seem like there was much more he wanted to express. Madison climbed the stairs slowly, feeling as if each step took her away from something important that had remained unfinished between them. She reached the hallway and began walking toward her suite, searching for the golden key in her purse. The tension between her and Alexander had evolved into something more complex than simple physical attraction. There was a mutual understanding forming, a connection that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. She turned to climb the stairs leading to the private area of her suite, but stopped completely when she realized she wasn't alone in the hallway. "How long have you been standing there?" He was standing there, watching, feeling. The red silk dress embraced Madison's body like a second skin, each movement creating fluid waves in the fabric that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers in the ballroom. She had chosen the color deliberately, a silent statement that she would no longer be the shy young woman who had arrived at this house a week ago. Alexander waited for her at the bottom of the staircase, impeccable in his black tuxedo, but it was the way his eyes narrowed slightly upon seeing her that confirmed her choice of outfit had hit its intended target. He offered his arm with the formal courtesy she was learning to recognize as his emotional armor, but Madison felt the tension in his muscles when she accepted the gesture. The charity event was a social obligation, he had explained, a necessary appearance to maintain certain appearances. "Are you trying to kill me, Madison?" The ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel buzzed with the local elite. Men in expensive tuxedos conversing in groups while their wives displayed jewelry worth more than the house where Madison had grown up. She felt the weight of curious glances the moment she entered with Alexander, discreet whispers following them as they walked through the hall. It was their first public appearance as a couple, and Madison realized she was being evaluated, judged, catalogued by people who had probably known Alexander for years but had never seen him accompanied. His hand on her back was possessive, guiding her through the crowd with a silent authority that made people automatically step aside to make way. When he leaned in to whisper in her ear, his warm breath against her skin sent shivers down her entire spine. "Stay close. Some of these people are more dangerous than they appear." Madison was introduced to a succession of smiling faces and firm handshakes, each person clearly curious about Alexander's mysterious bride, but too polite to ask direct questions. She noticed how everyone showed an almost imperceptible deference toward him, as if he were discreet royalty in a kingdom that operated by unwritten rules. The women observed her with a mixture of envy and compassion that intrigued her, as if they knew something about her future that she herself didn't. Alexander never left her alone for more than a few moments, always appearing by her side when a conversation went on too long, or when someone asked very specific questions about her previous life. His protection was subtle but absolute, like that of an invisible bodyguard that she began to appreciate more than she expected. "Why do all these women look at me as if I were a lamb being led to slaughter?" It was during her third glass of champagne that Madison met Ryan. He approached when Alexander was momentarily distracted in a business conversation with a group of older men, his approach casual but clearly calculated. Ryan was young, perhaps a few years older than her, with carefully disheveled blonde hair and a smile that probably melted female hearts with ease. He wore a tuxedo that cost a fortune, but managed to make it look casual, and there was a lightness in his way of moving that contrasted markedly with Alexander's controlled intensity. When he introduced himself as the owner of a boutique hotel chain, Madison realized that he represented exactly the kind of normal life she had abandoned when she agreed to marry Alexander. "You must be the famous Madison. The whole city is talking about Alexander's mysterious bride." "I hope they're saying good things," Madison replied, accepting the hand he offered in a greeting that extended slightly beyond what was necessary. There was something comforting about Ryan's normalcy, in the way he looked at her as if she was simply an attractive woman at a party, not a piece in a complicated game she barely understood. They chatted easily about trivial things, travel, books, movies, subjects she hadn't discussed with anyone for weeks. Ryan had a sense of humor that made her laugh genuinely for the first time since arriving at the mansion, and she realized how much she had missed simple, uncomplicated conversations. When the band started playing and he offered his hand to dance, Madison instinctively looked in the direction where she had left Alexander, but he was absorbed in a serious conversation that seemed to demand his full attention. One dance can't hurt anyone. The dance floor was moderately full, couples slowly twirling to the sound of a classic waltz that echoed off the marble walls of the ballroom. Ryan was a competent dancer, guiding her confidently through the steps while maintaining light conversation that helped her relax. Madison felt almost normal for the first time in weeks, as if she were just a young woman at an elegant party, dancing with a charming man who was clearly interested in her. She almost managed to forget the complications of her current life, losing herself in the music and the sensation of being courted in a traditional and uncomplicated manner. It was only when Ryan pulled her slightly closer during a slower passage of the music that she realized they were no longer alone in their little bubble of normalcy. Alexander's eyes were fixed on them from across the room, and even at a distance, Madison could feel the intensity of his gaze like a physical force. "Your fiancé doesn't seem very happy with our dance." Madison followed Ryan's gaze and found Alexander standing near the bar, his business conversation apparently abandoned. There was something predatory in his posture, a tension in his shoulders that she had learned to recognize as a sign of imminent danger. His eyes were fixed on Ryan with an intensity that could melt steel, and Madison felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement as she realized he was clearly jealous. Ryan must have noticed the change in atmosphere too, because his hand on her back became slightly protective, as if he were unconsciously preparing to defend her from some undefined threat. The music continued, but Madison noticed that several people around the dance floor had noticed the tension, their gazes discreetly alternating between her, Ryan, and Alexander. "Maybe we should stop dancing," she suggested, but her voice betrayed a reluctance that surprised her. "Why should we?" Ryan responded, his grip becoming slightly firmer, as if he were deliberately challenging Alexander's silent authority. "You're having fun, I'm having fun. That's all that matters at a party." There was a nuance of defiance in his voice that made Madison realize that Ryan knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't as innocent as he seemed, and his decision to prolong the dance was a deliberate statement that left her simultaneously nervous and intrigued. She could feel Alexander's eyes like a physical pressure against her back, and when Ryan twirled her, she saw him approaching the dance floor with movements that seemed casual, but were clearly determined. The air in the ballroom seemed to grow denser, charged with a tension that other people began to notice, conversations diminishing in volume as curious eyes turned to the silent drama unfolding. "He's coming over here, isn't he?" Madison didn't need to answer, because Alexander was already there, materializing beside them with the silent grace of a predator. He didn't say a word initially, just extended his hand to Madison with an authority that admitted no refusal. Ryan hesitated for a moment, as if considering ignoring the silent request, but something in Alexander's gaze must have convinced him it would be unwise. Madison felt the shift of power in the air, the way Ryan reluctantly released her waist and took a step back, acknowledging he had met his limits. When Alexander pulled her into his arms, replacing Ryan without ceremony, Madison felt as if the oxygen had been sucked from the environment around them. Their bodies fit together perfectly, as if they had danced together 1,000 times before, and the intensity of the moment made everything around them disappear. "You like dangerous games, Madison." Alexander's voice was low, whispered against her ear in a way that sent waves of heat through her body. His hand on her back was possessive, pressing her against him with a firmness that made it clear he had no intention of letting her escape again. Madison could feel the tension radiating from him, a rigorously maintained control that threatened to break at any moment. They moved in perfect synchronization, as if their bodies had a language of their own that dispensed with words or conscious thought. When she dared to look into his eyes, she found something wild and dangerous moving in the dark depths, something that made her realize she had completely underestimated the intensity of the feelings he had been hiding. The physical proximity between them was creating an almost unbearable sexual tension, each movement of the dance increasing the pressure building between them. "I didn't know it was a game." "Everything is a game when you live in my world," Alexander replied, his lips so close to her ear that she could feel their movement against her skin. "And you just learned an important rule. What is mine, stays mine." The words should have sounded like a threat, but the way he said them, loaded with possessiveness and contained desire, made something stir deeply within Madison. She realized she was being marked, publicly claimed in a way that went far beyond the terms of their marriage agreement. When the music came to an end and other couples began to leave the dance floor, Alexander didn't release her immediately. Instead, he held her for a few more seconds, as if reluctant to break the physical connection between them. "You're jealous," she said, and it wasn't a question. The accusation made something pass through Alexander's eyes, a vulnerability that was quickly suppressed, but not before Madison had seen it. He released her abruptly, but before she could feel the loss, he took her hand and began guiding her through the crowd toward the French doors that led to the veranda. His strides were long and determined, forcing her to almost run to keep up with his pace, and Madison realized that other people were watching their hasty exit with barely disguised interest. The night air on the veranda was cool against her heated skin, a gentle breeze carrying the perfume of the hotel garden flowers. Alexander guided her to the most private corner of the veranda, where the lights from the ballroom created deep shadows that hid them from the curious eyes of other guests. "Jealousy implies I have something to lose," he finally said, but his voice betrayed the lie in his words. "And you don't?" Madison asked, taking a step toward him with an audacity that surprised her. The relative privacy of the veranda had broken something in her composure, releasing a courage she didn't know she possessed. Alexander was leaning against the marble parapet, his hands resting on the cold stone, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world. The soft light coming from the ballroom cast dramatic shadows on his face, accentuating the strong line of his jaw and the scar that cut across his eyebrow. Madison took another step toward him, further reducing the distance between them, until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Why did you bring me here, Alexander?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Alexander pushed away from the parapet, closing the remaining distance between them in a fluid movement that left her cornered between his body and the veranda wall. His hands rested on the wall on either side of her head, creating a cage of muscle and sexual tension that made Madison forget how to breathe. She could see every detail of his face now, every expression line that spoke of years living on the edge, every scar that told a story she didn't yet know. His masculine scent mingled with the night air, creating an intoxicating combination that made her want to lean in closer. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, laden with a desire he was no longer trying to hide. "Because if I had to watch that man touch you for one more second, I would have completely lost control." The raw confession took Madison's breath away. She had suspected there was more behind his actions than mere possessiveness, but hearing the direct admission of the intensity of his feelings left her trembling. Alexander was visibly fighting against something internal, his muscles tense with the effort to maintain control, but his eyes devoured her as if she were something precious and dangerous he couldn't resist. Madison slowly raised her hand, touching the scar on his eyebrow with trembling fingers, and felt how he shuddered under her touch. "Then show me what you wanted to do," she whispered, the words coming out before she could think better of them. The provocation broke what remained of Alexander's control. His hands left the wall to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheeks with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, they just looked at each other, the air between them vibrating with unexplored possibilities. When he finally leaned toward her, it was with deliberately slow movements, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Madison didn't want to pull away. "Madison," he whispered her name, like a prayer or a curse. The kiss was everything Madison had imagined, and nothing she could have predicted. Alexander kissed her, as if she were air and he was drowning, with a desperate hunger that made her realize he had been denying himself this for much longer than she had imagined. Madison felt her legs go weak, and she had to lean on him to keep from falling, her hands clutching the lapels of his tuxedo as if they were her only anchor in reality. The world around them completely disappeared, reduced to just the sensation of his lips on hers and the heat of his body pressed against hers. "God, Madison, what are you doing to me?" He pulled away first, but only slightly, their heavy breaths mingling in the small space between them. Madison opened her eyes slowly, finding him looking at her with an expression that was part wonder, part terror. The kiss had changed something fundamental between them, crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, and both seemed to be struggling to process the implications. Madison could feel her lips still tingling where his had been, and she knew she would never forget the feeling of that moment. He pulled away first, but the taste remained on her lips like an unfulfilled promise. The 3 days that followed the kiss were a kind of torture that Madison had never experienced before. Alexander had completely disappeared from her life, avoiding her with surgical precision that suggested deliberate planning. She didn't see him at mealtimes, didn't hear his footsteps through the corridors, no longer felt that constant presence that had become her silent company. The mansion, which was already too big for 2 people, now seemed vast as a mausoleum, each room echoing with his absence. How can someone disappear so completely inside their own house? On the fourth day, Madison finally decided to seek him out directly. She had memorized the house schedule during her weeks there and knew he usually worked in the library during mornings when there were no scheduled meetings. She went down the stairs with her heart beating rapidly, mentally rehearsing what she would say, how she would address the giant elephant that had settled between them since that night. The library door was ajar, and she could hear the low sound of his voice on the phone, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. "Can I come in? Or are you going to keep pretending I don't exist?" Alexander raised his eyes from his papers slowly, and Madison saw the exact moment when he raised his emotional defenses. It was like watching a door closing, all traces of vulnerability she had seen on the porch being carefully stored behind a mask of professional coldness. He ended the call with a short phrase and placed the phone down with deliberately controlled movements, as if giving himself time to completely compose his emotional armor. "Madison, is there something you need?" The icy formality in his voice was like a slap. Madison entered the library and closed the door behind her, the sound echoing in the tense silence between them. She approached the desk where he worked, but Alexander made no move to stand up or show any courtesy he had shown previously. The physical distance between them seemed insurmountable, even though there were only a few meters separating them. "We need to talk about what happened at the event." "There's nothing to talk about," Alexander replied, his eyes already returning to the documents on his desk, as if she were a minor interruption in his day. "It was an error in judgment on my part. It won't happen again." The casual dismissal of a moment that had changed everything for her was like a stab in the chest. Madison felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall in front of him. "An error? Is that what you call it?" "That's exactly what it was," he said without raising his eyes again, his voice maintaining that professional and distant tone that was slowly killing her. "A momentary confusion about the nature of our agreement. Fortunately, we still have time to correct any misunderstanding before things get unnecessarily complicated." Each word was chosen with surgical precision to hurt, to reduce what had happened between them to cold commercial terms. Madison moved closer to the table, her hands resting on the polished wooden surface as she leaned toward him. "You're lying, to me and to yourself." The accusation made something pass through Alexander's eyes, an almost imperceptible contraction that confirmed her suspicions. But his voice remained icy when he responded, each word heavy with a finality that frightened her. "What you think you saw on the veranda, Madison, was the result of champagne, atmosphere, and forced proximity. Nothing more." He finally rose from the chair, but only to distance himself from her, walking to the window that offered a view of the gardens. "So you're going to pretend that nothing has changed between us?" "Nothing has changed," Alexander said, but his voice lacked the conviction that his words demanded. "Our agreement remains the same, a marriage of convenience, advantageous to both families. Anything beyond that would be too complicated to be practical." He kept his back turned to her as he spoke, as if he couldn't lie to her face convincingly. Madison studied his silhouette cut against the window light, noticing details that betrayed his composure, the unnatural rigidity of his posture, the way his hands remained closed in fists. Complicated, like feeling something real for someone. The question finally made Alexander turn, and for a moment, Madison saw something raw and vulnerable in his eyes before he managed to mask it again. "Real feelings are luxuries that people like me cannot afford, Madison," he said, and this time there was a note of something like regret in his voice. "They make people weak, unpredictable, vulnerable. In my world, any of these can be fatal." There was honesty in his words now, but it was an honesty that hurt her even more than his previous lies. "So you choose to feel nothing?" "I choose to survive," Alexander replied, and for the first time since she entered the library, his voice carried real emotion. "And to keep the people who matter to me safe. Sometimes that means making choices that hurt in the moment, but protect in the long run." The implication that she mattered to him didn't go unnoticed, but it also didn't offer the consolation it might have in other circumstances. Madison felt a mixture of frustration and heartache that made her want to scream, cry, or force him to admit the truth. "What if I don't want to be protected? What if I want to take the risks?" "Then you're more innocent than I thought," Alexander said, his voice returning to that cutting coldness she was learning to hate. You have no idea what you're offering, nor what it would cost." He walked back to his desk, gathering the scattered papers with abrupt movements that betrayed his internal agitation. It was clear that the conversation had come to an end, at least for him. "This conversation is over, Madison. I suggest you accept things as they are." But Madison couldn't accept, the pain of rejection mixed with a growing anger that surprised her with its intensity. "You're a coward," she said, the words coming out before she could stop herself. "You hide behind your coldness and your rules because you're afraid of what you might feel if you allow yourself to be human." The accusation made Alexander freeze completely. His fingers paused over the papers. "You can pretend that kiss meant nothing, but I know you're lying." Alexander raised his eyes slowly, and when their gazes met, Madison saw something dangerous moving in the dark depths of his eyes. "Do you want to know the truth about that kiss, Madison?" he asked, his voice low and charged, with an intensity that made her instinctively step back. "The truth is that it was a mistake, because it made me want things I cannot have. Because for a moment it made me forget who I am and what that means for anyone foolish enough to get involved with me." Madison felt tears finally escape, running silently down her cheeks. "So now you know. Are you satisfied?" The casual cruelty of his final question broke something inside Madison. She wiped away the tears with the back of her hand, gathering the last fragments of her dignity as she straightened to face him one last time. "Perfectly," she answered, her voice surprisingly steady considering how she felt inside. "Thank you for clarifying exactly where I stand on your list of priorities." She turned to leave the library, but stopped at the door. "You're right about one thing, Alexander. I really was too innocent, but not about the risks of getting involved with you. I was innocent about you having a heart to begin with." The following hours passed in a haze of pain and renewed determination. Madison went up to her suite and began methodically packing, folding each piece of expensive clothing she found in her closet with mechanical care. She called her mother, briefly explaining that the marriage arrangement had been cancelled, and asked to return home. While packing her few personal possessions, Madison allowed herself to cry freely, mourning not just the end of her relationship with Alexander, but the death of possibilities that would never have a chance to bloom. "At least now I know where we stand." When her suitcase was ready and the car had arrived to pick her up, Madison took one last walk through the mansion. The housekeeper waited for her at the main entrance, her eyes gentle but sad. "Are you sure this is the right decision, miss?" she asked softly. "Sometimes things worth having take more time to bloom." "Some things simply weren't made to bloom," Madison replied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. She looked one last time at the main staircase, half expecting to see Alexander there, perhaps coming to stop her or at least say a proper goodbye, but there was no one. As she settled into the back seat, Madison allowed herself one final look at the mansion. "At least I tried." The car began to move along the long circular driveway, and Madison kept her eyes fixed on the mansion until it disappeared from view behind the wrought-iron gates. She didn't see Alexander standing at the window of his suite, watching the car drive away with an expression that completely contradicted the coldness he had shown in the library. She didn't see how his hands closed into fists against the glass of the window. What have I done? That night, Madison was back in her small suburban apartment, a space that seemed microscopic after the grandeur of Alexander's mansion. More painful than adjusting back to modesty was Alexander's absence, the way her apartment seemed to have a hole in the shape of him that she couldn't ignore. "At least here I can cry without an audience." Meanwhile, Alexander stood in the hallway outside what had been Madison's room, his hand raised, as if to knock on the door he knew to be locked and empty. The decision to let her go had been tactical, protective, necessary. But none of these justifications could explain why his chest felt like it had been hollowed out, or why each breath seemed harder than it should be. She closed the bedroom door, and he didn't try to stop her. But he stood on the other side until the sun rose. 3 weeks had passed since Madison left the mansion. 3 weeks trying to rebuild a life that now seemed too small to contain everything she had become. The coffee shop where she had found employment was in the city center, a cozy establishment that served specialty coffees to hurried executives and students. She liked the work, the simple routine, the brief but kind interactions with customers, the feeling of doing something productive. But even surrounded by the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and the constant hum of conversations, Madison felt as if an essential part of herself had been left behind in that mansion. At least here, nobody looks at me as if they know my secrets. The doorbell rang, announcing the entrance of another customer, and Madison looked up from the counter she was cleaning to greet whoever was arriving. Her professional smile froze when she saw Ryan standing at the entrance, his eyes scanning the environment until they found her. He wore an expensive suit that contrasted with the simplicity of the cafe, and there was something in his posture that immediately made her feel uncomfortable. When he approached the counter, his smile was the same one she remembered from the event, but there was something behind it that she couldn't fully decipher. "Madison, what a pleasant surprise to find you here." "Ryan," she replied, forcing politeness into her voice while continuing to clean the counter, to have something to occupy her hands. "What can I get you?" She kept her tone professional, hoping he would get the message that this was a customer-employee interaction, nothing more. But Ryan leaned over the counter, invading her personal space in a way that made her instinctively back away. There was something different about him since the event, a confidence that bordered on presumption. "Actually, I didn't come for the coffee, I came for you." The direct statement caught her off guard, and Madison felt a chill in her stomach that had nothing to do with attraction. "Ryan, I'm working," she said, trying to keep her tone light while moving slightly away from the counter. "If you want coffee, I'll be happy to serve you, otherwise." She left the sentence hanging, hoping he would take the hint. But instead of backing away, Ryan moved even closer, his hands resting on the counter possessively. "You don't need to pretend with me, Madison. I know things didn't work out with Alexander." "My personal life is none of your business," she replied, her voice gaining a firmness she hoped sounded more convincing than it felt. "And even if it were, I'm at work. This is neither the place nor the time for this conversation." Ryan didn't move, and Madison realized the situation was quickly becoming uncomfortable. There were other customers in the cafe, but they all seemed absorbed in their own conversations, oblivious to the tension that was building. "Please respect that, and let me work in peace." "Then let's go somewhere else," Ryan said, his voice gaining an intensity that made her realize he wouldn't easily take no for an answer. "Finish your shift, and let's have dinner. I have a reservation at a very nice restaurant downtown." It wasn't an invitation, it was a statement, and the presumption in his voice made something tighten in Madison's stomach. She looked around the cafe, searching for her supervisor, but he had left for a meeting. "I can't leave work, and even if I could, it wouldn't be appropriate." "Appropriate?" Ryan laughed, but there was no real humor in his voice. "Madison, you work in an ordinary cafe after having lived in one of the most luxurious houses in the city. Clearly, you need someone who can take care of you properly." His words carried a condescension that made her clench her fists involuntarily. The way he spoke about her current situation, as if it was something to be ashamed of, touched on insecurities she had tried to suppress. Alexander clearly didn't know how to value what he had. "I wouldn't make the same mistake." Ryan walked around the counter, invading her workspace in a way that made Madison realize the situation was completely getting out of control. "You're being stubborn," he said, his voice low but charged with a firmness that frightened her. "I'm offering you a chance to return to the kind of life you deserve. All you need to do is accept my company." His hands reached toward her arms, and Madison instinctively backed away, her heart racing. "Don't touch me. I'm serious, Ryan." "Or what?" he asked, taking another step toward her. "You'll call your ex-fiancé to protect you. I have news for you, Madison. Alexander got rid of you. He's no longer interested." The words were deliberately cruel, calculated to hurt, and Madison felt tears burning behind her eyes. There was enough truth in what Ryan said to make his words especially painful, but there was also a malice that made her realize he was willing to hurt her emotionally to get what he wanted. He made it very clear that you meant nothing to him. Madison was about to respond when she felt a change in the cafe's air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a quality in the atmosphere that made her look toward the entrance. Alexander was standing there, and the way he filled the space with his presence made the entire cafe seem smaller. He didn't say anything, didn't make any dramatic movement, but there was something in his silent posture that made Ryan move away from her instantly. Madison felt her heart race for completely different reasons now, a mixture of relief, fear, and something more complex. How does he always know when I need him? Ryan turned slowly to face Alexander, and Madison saw the exact moment when he realized he had made a serious mistake. The arrogant confidence he had shown with her evaporated instantly, replaced by something that looked very much like genuine fear. Alexander didn't say a word, didn't make any verbal threat, but his mere presence communicated more than any speech could have done. He walked slowly through the cafe until he stopped at a respectful distance from Madison, but close enough to make it clear she was under his protection. "Madison, are you okay?" The simple question, asked with a gentleness that completely contrasted with the coldness he had shown in the library, almost completely undid her. Madison nodded, not trusting her voice to respond verbally, but her eyes couldn't leave his face. There was something different about Alexander today, a carefully controlled vulnerability, suggesting that the last few weeks had been as difficult for him as they had been for her. When he extended his hand toward her, it wasn't an order or a demand, but a silent invitation that she was free to accept or refuse. "Did you come to get me?" "Always," Alexander replied, and the absolute simplicity of his answer contained more promises than any elaborate declaration could have made. "If you want to come with me." There was a humility in his voice that Madison had never heard before, as if he was genuinely uncertain about her response. Ryan was still there, watching the exchange between them, but neither was paying attention to him. Madison studied Alexander's face, looking for signs of the emotional defenses he had erected in the library, but found only raw honesty and carefully contained hope. "And this time you won't run away." "This time I'm going to fight," he said, and Madison knew he wasn't just talking about Ryan. There were layers to his promise that spoke of all the battles he had avoided, all the feelings he had denied. The realization that he was offering to lower his defenses, to become vulnerable for her, was overwhelming. Madison looked at his outstretched hand, knowing that accepting meant more than simply leaving the cafe with him. It meant accepting to return to a world she had tried to leave behind, accepting the complications that came with loving someone like Alexander. "Then let's go home." The word home made something pass through Alexander's eyes, an emotion so intense that he had to look away momentarily. When he looked at her again, there was a gratitude in his expression that made her realize how much her response had meant to him. Madison placed her hand in his, and the physical contact was like completing an electrical circuit. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had never been separated. Alexander guided her toward the exit, and she didn't even bother to look back to see Ryan's reaction. "I should never have let you go." The journey back to the mansion was made in a silence laden with unexplored possibilities. Madison observed Alexander's profile as he drove, noticing details she had forgotten during their separation. There was a tentative peace between them that was different from anything they had shared before, a mutual acceptance that they had reached a point where pretending to feel nothing was no longer a viable option. When they arrived at the gates of the mansion, Madison felt as if she were returning home after a long absence. "Do you really want this to work?" "I want to try," Alexander replied, and the honesty in his voice was almost painful in its intensity. "I want to stop being afraid of what it might cost and start thinking about what it might be worth." He stopped the car in the circular driveway and turned to face her completely, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her feel as if he were seeing directly into her soul. There was so much that needed to be said between them, so many wounds that needed healing, so many fears that needed confronting. "We both know it won't be easy." "The best things never are," Madison replied, and when he got out of the car to open her door, she realized they were about to begin something completely new. When Alexander extended his hand to help her out of the car, Madison accepted it without hesitation, and this time when their fingers intertwined, it was with the understanding that they were choosing to be together. They walked together toward the entrance of the mansion, and Madison knew she was returning not as a reluctant bride, but as a woman who had chosen to fight for something worthwhile. "Is this really our second chance?" Alexander paused on the threshold, his fingers tightening around hers with a firmness that spoke of determination and promise. "This is our first real chance," he corrected, and Madison knew he was right. Everything that had happened before had been preparation for this moment. for this conscious choice to try to build something together. When he brought her hand to his lips and gently kissed her fingers, Madison felt as if he was sealing a pact that went far beyond any marriage contract. He held her hand like someone who would never let go again. Did you like Madison and Alexander's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.